Imagine a witch so devoted to evil that she became the very embodiment of cruelty in the wizarding world. A woman who transformed her noble lineage into a synonym for terror, who made torture a sadistic art, and who loved darkness with a passion that transcended any limits of human sanity. This is the story of Bellatrix Lestrange, the most loyal and cruel of all the Death Eaters, a witch whose bloodlust and fanatical devotion to Lord Voldemort transformed her into the most feared creature in the wizarding world. Prepare to delve into the depths of a mind corrupted by power and obsession, where every choice led inexorably to destruction and tragedy. Before we begin this dark journey through the life of the most dangerous witch of the modern age, help me reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. If you're ready to explore the darkest corners of magical history, click the notification bell and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know where the brave ones who dare to learn the truth behind the wizarding world's most feared names come from. Bellatrix Lestrange's story begins long before her birth, in the deep, twisted roots of one of the oldest and proudest pure-blood families in magical Britain. The Black family had built its reputation over centuries on pillars of pure-blood supremacy, uncompromising tradition, and an unshakable belief that only those with pure magical lineage possessed the right to rule the wizarding world. This toxic philosophy would be the poison that would course through young Bellatrix's veins from the moment she took her first breath. Born in 1951, Bellatrix Black was born into the luxury and privilege of the noble Black household. Her mother, Druella Rosier, came from another pure-blood family with a long history of supporting the dark arts, while her father, Sirius Black, was a respected member of the traditional House of Black. From birth, Bellatrix was raised to believe she was superior to almost all other wizards and witches simply because of the blood that ran through her veins. This innate arrogance would be shaped and refined over the years, transforming into the ruthless superiority that would define her adult personality. Bellatrix's childhood was spent in the ornate rooms and shadowy corridors of Black Manor, where portraits of ancestors whispered tales of past glory and magical supremacy. She grew up hearing tales of how her family had helped shape the wizarding world, how they had resisted the contamination of mudbloods, and how it was her sacred duty to maintain the purity of her lineage. These lessons were not merely imparted through words, but were ingrained in the very atmosphere of the house, where every decorative object, every family tradition, every ritual celebrated reinforced the message of racial superiority. As the eldest child, Bellatrix received special attention from her parents, who saw in her the potential to become the torchbearer of the family tradition for the next generation. She demonstrated early signs of considerable magical power, with episodes of accidental magic that were more intense and controlled than normal for a child her age. These early glimpses of her natural talent were celebrated by her family as evidence of her innate superiority, further fueling her developing ego and their belief that she was destined for greatness. Bellatrix's two younger sisters, Andromeda and Narcissa, also grew up under the same indoctrination, but each reacted differently to family pressure. Andromeda, the middle sister, always showed signs of questioning family traditions, a tendency that deeply concerned her parents. Narcissa, the youngest, embraced family expectations, but in a more calculated and less passionate manner than Bellatrix. It was evident from an early age that Bellatrix possessed an intensity and fanaticism that distinguished her even within her own extremist family. By the time Bellatrix attended Hogwarts in 1962, she had already been completely shaped by her family's ideology. Her sorting into Slytherin was as inevitable as the sunrise. She possessed all the qualities the house valued: boundless ambition, natural cunning, iron determination, and a willingness to use any means necessary to achieve her goals. Most importantly, She had fully absorbed the belief that she was inherently superior to her peers and that this superiority granted her special rights. During her early years at Hogwarts, Bellatrix quickly established herself as a force to be reckoned with. She was academically brilliant, particularly in spells that could be used to inflict pain or control others. Her natural affinity for the dark arts was evident to any attentive teacher, but at the time, such interest was seen more as intellectual curiosity than as a sign of impending danger. She excelled in defense against the dark arts, ironically, because her intimate understanding of dark magic made her exceptionally adept at countering it when necessary. Socially, Bellatrix gravitated toward other students from pure-blood families who shared her views. She formed a close circle of followers who admired her confidence, feared her sharp tongue, and were inspired by her passion for magical supremacy. Even at a young age, she demonstrated natural leadership skills, though these were tempered by a casual cruelty that manifested itself in her willingness to publicly humiliate those she considered inferior. Bellatrix's years at Hogwarts coincided with a period of growing tension in the wizarding world. Rumors of a young dark wizard calling himself Lord Voldemort began circulating among certain pure-blood families during her final years at school. These whispers found fertile ground in Bellatrix's already radicalized mind, who saw in such reports the promise of a future where her beliefs about magical supremacy could be implemented on a social scale. During this period, Bellatrix began experimenting with increasingly dark magic. She used her privileged position and family connections to access books and knowledge that were theoretically beyond the reach of students. Her thirst for knowledge about offensive spells and mind control magic grew steadily, fueled by both intellectual curiosity and a growing desire for power over others. Her teachers began to notice a disturbing change in Bellatrix during her final years at Hogwarts. Although she maintained excellent grades and technically followed all school rules, there was something in her eyes, a cold, calculating intensity that hinted at depths of ambition and cruelty that went far beyond what would be normal, even for an ambitious young Slytherin. Some more perceptive teachers tried to steer her in more constructive directions, but their efforts were invariably rebuffed with polite but firm resistance. Bellatrix's graduation from Hogwarts in 1969 marked the end of her formal education, but only the beginning of her true journey into darkness. The wizarding world was changing rapidly, and rumors about Lord Voldemort were no longer distant whispers, but tangible realities affecting families across the country. For Bellatrix, these changes represented opportunities rather than threats. She saw Voldemort's emergence as a chance to see her deepest beliefs validated and implemented. Shortly after leaving Hogwarts, Bellatrix was introduced to Lord Voldemort through family connections. The meeting was arranged by older relatives who had already joined the Dark Lord's inner circle. Recognizing in Bellatrix the kind of talent and fanaticism that Voldemort valued in his followers. This first meeting would be the defining moment that would define the rest of Bellatrix's life, transforming her latent dark tendencies into absolute, obsessive devotion. Voldemort, for his part, immediately recognized Bellatrix's potential. She possessed a rare combination of exceptional magical ability, valuable social connections, and most importantly, a seemingly limitless capacity for cruelty that would astonish even someone of his experience. He saw in her not just a useful follower, but someone who could become one of his deadliest weapons, an extension of his own will capable of acts that even other Death Eaters might hesitate to perform. Bellatrix's initiation as a Death Eater was more than a simple ceremony. It was a spiritual transformation that completed her metamorphosis from privileged young witch to instrument of terror. The details of the ritual itself remain obscure, but its effects on Bellatrix were immediately apparent. She emerged from the experience with a devotion to Voldemort that transcended normal loyalty and entered the realm of religious worship. To her, Voldemort was not just a leader to be followed, but a deity to be worshipped. This extreme devotion manifested itself in ways that even other Death Eaters found disturbing. Bellatrix spoke of Voldemort with a reverence bordering on religious ecstasy, referred to him in terms that suggested she saw him as something beyond human mortality, and demonstrated a willingness to make any sacrifice in his name that surpassed even the extreme standards expected of his followers. Her obsession with him was total and consumed every aspect of her personality. As a Death Eater, Bellatrix quickly established herself as one of Voldemort's most effective and feared operatives. Her combination of exceptional magical ability, strategic intelligence, and boundless ruthlessness made her ideal for the darkest and most important missions. She developed a particular reputation for her skill with the Cruciatus Curse, which she applied with an artistic precision that suggested not only technical competence, but also genuine pleasure in the suffering she inflicted. During the 1970s, as Voldemort's first reign of terror intensified, Bellatrix was involved in some of the period's most horrific atrocities. While the specific details of many of her actions remain hidden in the Ministry of Magic's most secret files, there is sufficient evidence to establish that she personally participated in multiple murders, torture, and other activities that demonstrated her complete disregard for human life and dignity. One of Bellatrix's most disturbing characteristics was her ability to maintain a facade of social respectability even while committing atrocities. She continued to attend high society wizarding events, maintained cordial relationships with families who were unaware of her secret activities, and even managed to appear charming and sophisticated when the situation demanded it. This duality made her particularly dangerous, as few suspected the true extent of her corruption until it was too late. In 1975, Bellatrix married Rodolphus Lestrange, a member of another ancient pureblood family who had also joined the Death Eater ranks. The marriage was both a political and a personal alliance, uniting two powerful families under the banner of pure blood supremacy. However, it was clear to all who witnessed the ceremony that Bellatrix's true love would never be for her husband, but would remain eternally devoted to Lord Voldemort. Rodolphus Lestrange, though also committed to Voldemort's cause, never possessed his wife's fanatical intensity. He was cruel and ambitious, certainly, but in a more conventional and understandable way. Bellatrix's all-consuming passion for Voldemort created a strange dynamic in her marriage, where her husband often found himself competing for her attention with a man she considered a living god. The marriage also brought Bellatrix closer to Rabastan Lestrange, Rodolphus's younger brother, who quickly fell under her influence. Rabastan was younger and more impressionable than his brother, and Bellatrix found she could easily shape his opinions and actions. This influence over the Lestrange brothers significantly increased her power within Death Eater circles and gave her additional resources to carry out Voldemort's missions. As the 1970s progressed and the First War against Voldemort intensified, Bellatrix became one of his most trusted and valuable lieutenants. She led raids on Muggle families, coordinated intimidation operations against wizards who opposed Voldemort's regime, and carried out interrogations that often resulted in death or insanity for the victims. Her reputation grew not only among the Death Eaters, but also among her enemies, who began to speak of Bellatrix Lestrange in fearful whispers. One of the most significant operations Bellatrix was involved in during this period was a series of coordinated attacks against Aura families who were proving particularly effective in combating Voldemort's forces. These attacks were not simply assassinations, they were carefully orchestrated statements designed to sow terror within the ranks of those who opposed the Dark Lord. Bellatrix developed a particular signature for these attacks, leaving evidence of her presence that served as both a calling card and a warning to others. Her skill with torture spells became legendary even among other Death Eaters, She not only technically mastered the unforgivable curses, but applied them with an artistic creativity that suggested a deep understanding of human psychology and an ability to find precisely the pressure points that would cause maximum suffering. Victims who survived her interrogations often emerged with permanent psychological damage that haunted them for the rest of their lives. During this period, Bellatrix also developed a reputation for her absolute loyalty to Voldemort. While other Death Eaters occasionally questioned certain decisions or hesitated when faced with particularly extreme orders, Bellatrix never showed the slightest hint of doubt or reluctance. This utter trustworthiness made her one of Voldemort's unofficial advisors, someone with whom he could discuss even his darkest plans without fear of betrayal or judgment. However, Bellatrix's fanatical loyalty also had its problematic aspects. Her devotion was so intense that she sometimes interpreted Voldemort's instructions in ways that went beyond their original intentions, or took unauthorized initiatives that she believed he would approve. While Voldemort generally appreciated her zeal, there were times when her impulsiveness created unnecessary complications for his larger plans. A notable example of this occurred during a planned operation to infiltrate the Ministry of Magic. Bellatrix had been instructed to obtain specific information through discreet methods, but her impatience and thirst for violence led her to prematurely torture a key official, alerting the ministry to the infiltration before the main objectives were achieved. Although Voldemort expressed his frustration with this deviation from the plan, he also recognized that Bellatrix's passion, even when misdirected, was preferable to her calculating coldness, which sometimes lacked sufficient fervor. The 1970s also saw Bellatrix embroiled in personal conflicts that mirrored the broader tensions of the war. Her sister, Andromeda, had married Ted Tonks, a Muggle-born, an act the Black family considered such a profound betrayal that it resulted in Andromeda's complete elimination from the family tree. Bellatrix, who had always viewed Andromeda as the weakest of the three sisters, reacted to this betrayal with a rage that transcended even her normal patterns of hatred. For Bellatrix, Andromeda's marriage represented more than a simple violation of family traditions. It was a personal rejection of everything she believed in and fought for. She swore that if she ever met her sister again, she would kill her with her own hands, not only as punishment for her betrayal, but as a demonstration of her own ideological purity. This familial rupture further solidified Bellatrix's extremist convictions and eliminated any shred of compassion that might have remained in her heart. The late 1970s and early 1980s marked the height of Voldemort's first campaign of terror, and Bellatrix was at the center of many of his most significant operations. She had become not just an executor of his orders, but an extension of his own will, able to anticipate his wishes and act on his behalf, even when he was not present to give direct instructions. This near telepathic connection between them was a source of immense pride for Bellatrix and further fueled her growing obsession. Then, on the night of October 31st, 1981, everything changed. Voldemort's attempt to murder the infant Harry Potter resulted in his own apparent destruction, leaving his followers lost, terrified, and directionless. For most Death Eaters, their master's death represented an opportunity to deny involvement, destroy evidence, and attempt to return to normal life. For Bellatrix, however, it represented something entirely different, a spiritual crisis that threatened to destroy the very core of her existence. The idea that Voldemort might truly be dead was something Bellatrix simply could not accept. Her devotion to him was so total that her mind automatically rejected any evidence of his permanent destruction. Instead, she developed a fanatical conviction that he had merely suffered a temporary setback and would return more powerful than ever. This belief became the organizing principle of her life during the dark years that followed. While other Death Eaters fled abroad, assumed false identities, or attempted to negotiate clemency with the Ministry of Magic, Bellatrix chose a different path. She refused to accept that the cause was lost, and instead began plotting ways to locate and resurrect her master. This determination led her to commit one of the most desperate and brutal acts of her career, the torture of Frank and Alice Longbottom. Frank and Alice Longbottom were respected Aurors who had played significant roles in the capture of several Death Eaters during the war. More importantly for Bellatrix, they were rumored to possess information about Voldemort's whereabouts or the circumstances of his apparent death. In her increasingly desperate mind, Bellatrix convinced herself that if she could extract this information, she might find a way to restore her master to power. On a freezing night in late 1981, Bellatrix, along with her husband Rodolphus, her brother-in-law Rabastan, and Barty Crouch Jr., attacked the Longbottom home. What followed was one of the most shocking displays of pure cruelty ever witnessed in the wizarding world. For hours, the 4 Death Eaters tortured the young couple with the Cruciatus Curse, demanding information that Frank and Alice clearly did not possess. Bellatrix led the torture with an intensity that impressed even her war-hardened companions. She applied the Cruciatus Curse with surgical precision, alternating between periods of excruciating pain and brief respites that allowed her victims to maintain enough consciousness to answer questions. When it became clear that the Longbottoms truly knew nothing useful, Bellatrix's frustration turned to pure rage, and she continued the torture far beyond any practical purpose. The result was devastating and permanent. Frank and Alice Longbottom were left in a state of complete insanity, their minds so completely destroyed by the prolonged torture that they could no longer recognize even their own young son, Neville. They were committed to the long-term ward of St. Mungo's Hospital, where they would spend the rest of their lives in a vegetative state, living reminders of Bellatrix's cruelty. The capture of Bellatrix and her accomplices was relatively quick. The attack on the Longbottoms had been so brutal and public that the Ministry of Magic had no choice but to mobilize all available resources to bring the perpetrators to justice. When they were finally captured, all 4 were tried in one of the most dramatic sessions in the Wizengamot's history. During her trial, Bellatrix displayed not only a lack of remorse, but also active pride in her actions. When confronted with evidence of her cruelty, she responded with arrogant defiance, publicly declaring her continued loyalty to Lord Voldemort and her belief that he would return to reward those who had remained faithful to him. Her statements in court were so shocking that even seasoned wizards in the audience were visibly disturbed by her utter coldness. The sentence was inevitable: life imprisonment in Azkaban, the most feared magical prison in the wizarding world. For most criminals, such a sentence would effectively end their lives, a fate worse than death due to the presence of the Dementors that drained all happiness and hope from the prisoners. For Bellatrix, however, Azkaban became something different, a test of her faith and devotion, a place where she could prove her unwavering loyalty to Voldemort through enduring suffering. Bellatrix's years in Azkaban were both a punishment and a transformation. Constant exposure to the Dementors would have broken most people, leaving them empty shells, devoid of any shred of humanity. Bellatrix, however, possessed a source of strength that partially protected her from the Dementors' most devastating effects. Her all-consuming obsession with Voldemort, her devotion to him, was so intense and so central to her identity that it almost acted as a protective charm against despair. While the Dementors drained her of her normal happy memories, they couldn't fully touch her happiness at serving Voldemort, because it wasn't a normal emotion, but something closer to a religious ecstasy that transcended the limits of ordinary human experience. During her years of imprisonment, Bellatrix developed a rigorous mental routine designed to maintain her sanity and her connection to Voldemort. She spent hours mentally reciting his teachings, planning what she would do when he returned, and cultivating her hatred for those who had dared to defy him. This mental discipline, combined with her exceptional natural willpower, allowed her to retain far more of her original personality than most long-term Azkaban prisoners. She also used her time in prison to further hone her magical abilities mentally. Although prisoners lacked access to wands, Bellatrix practiced spells and curses in her mind, visualizing every wand movement, every intonation, every flow of magical energy. This constant mental practice meant that when she finally regained her freedom, her skills would be not only intact, but potentially even sharper than before. The other prisoners of Azkaban quickly learned to avoid Bellatrix. Even in prison, her presence radiated a palpable menace that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable. She occasionally spoke to other former Death Eaters imprisoned in Azkaban, but always with contempt for their lack of faith in Voldemort's eventual resurrection. For her, her time in prison had only solidified her conviction that she was the most loyal of all his followers. For approximately 14 years, Bellatrix remained in Azkaban, her mind singularly focused on the day Voldemort would return and free her. Her faith was finally rewarded in January 1996, when a mass breakout was orchestrated that allowed her and several other Death Eaters to escape the prison. The breakout itself was planned and executed with a precision that suggested the involvement of highly organized outside forces, confirming to Bellatrix that her master had indeed returned. Bellatrix's reunion with Voldemort after her escape from Azkaban was a moment of religious ecstasy for her. Years of confinement, suffering and doubt, though she never admitted to doubting, were instantly erased by her master's presence. To Voldemort, Bellatrix's unwavering loyalty during his darkest years represented exactly the kind of devotion he valued above all else. He welcomed her back not just as a follower, but as one of his closest and most trusted lieutenants. However, the years in Azkaban had taken their toll on Bellatrix. Although her mind remained sharp and her devotion to Voldemort was stronger than ever, there was an added instability in her personality that had not been present before her imprisonment. Her outbursts of rage were more intense, her cruelty more capricious, and her connection to reality occasionally fragile. These residual effects of her prolonged exposure to the Dementors made her even more dangerous and unpredictable than before. Voldemort, recognizing both her value and her instability, used Bellatrix primarily for operations requiring maximum violence and intimidation. She became his weapon of choice for sending particularly brutal messages to his enemies, and her reputation grew to the point where the mere mention of her name was enough to sow panic throughout entire communities. One of Bellatrix's first significant missions after her return was leading an attack on the Ministry of Magic in June 1996. This operation, which became known as the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, represented the first time the wizarding public had incontrovertible evidence of Voldemort's return. Bellatrix led a group of Death Eaters in an attempt to retrieve a specific prophecy from the Ministry's archives, a mission that brought her into direct conflict with Harry Potter and his friends. During this battle, the true extent of Bellatrix's abilities was publicly displayed for the first time since her imprisonment. She demonstrated not only exceptional technical mastery of combat magic, but also a tactical creativity and casual brutality that impressed even seasoned aurors. Her ability to fight multiple opponents simultaneously while coordinating the movements of her subordinates showed that her years in Azkaban had only refined her natural leadership capabilities. It was during this battle that Bellatrix committed one of the acts that would forever define her in the eyes of the wizarding public: the murder of Sirius Black, her own cousin. Sirius had joined the fight against the Death Eaters as a member of the Order of the Phoenix, placing him in direct opposition to his family of origin. For Bellatrix, who had always viewed Sirius as a traitor to the Black Line, His presence in the battle represented a perfect opportunity to correct what she considered a stain on family honor. The duel between Bellatrix and Sirius was more than just a confrontation between opponents on opposing sides of a war. It was the culmination of decades of family resentment and ideological divergence. Sirius, who had completely rejected his family's supremacist values, represented everything Bellatrix despised about the modern weakness of the wizarding world. When she struck him with the curse that sent him through the veil in the Department of Mysteries, his expression showed not military triumph, but deep personal satisfaction at having finally punished the family's betrayal. Sirius's death had ramifications that reached far beyond the immediate battlefield. For Harry Potter, who had developed an almost paternal bond with Sirius, the murder represented a devastating personal loss that would fuel his hatred of Bellatrix for years to come. For Bellatrix, however, the act solidified her position as Voldemort's personal enforcer for matters requiring both skill and personal ruthlessness. In the months following the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, Bellatrix became increasingly central to Voldemort's operations. She was not only one of his most capable subordinates, but also one of the few people he trusted with knowledge of his most intimate secrets. This closeness to Voldemort further fueled Bellatrix's obsession as she began to interpret even her most casual interactions with him as signs of special favor. During this time, Bellatrix began to develop an intense rivalry with Severus Snape, who also held a position of trust in Voldemort's inner circle. She suspected correctly that Snape did not share her own pure devotion to her master, and she often openly questioned his loyalty at Death Eater meetings. This rivalry was fueled not simply by jealousy, but by a genuine concern that Snape might somehow taint or weaken the cause through his seemingly calculating nature. The animosity between Bellatrix and Snape reached its peak when Voldemort appointed Snape as Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts and gave him significant responsibilities in educating young wizards. Bellatrix saw this appointment as evidence that Voldemort was being deceived about Snape's true nature, and she made several attempts to expose what she considered his duplicity. Her suspicions, though based more on instinct than evidence, were surprisingly accurate. Bellatrix's relationship with her sister Narcissa also became more complex during this period. Narcissa had married Lucius Malfoy and had a son, Draco, who was approaching the age where he would be expected to join the ranks of the Death Eaters. Bellatrix saw her nephew as an opportunity to mold the next generation of pure-blood supremacists, but she also recognized that Narcissa possessed maternal instincts that could interfere with the young man's proper development. When Voldemort assigned Draco Malfoy to assassinate Albus Dumbledore as punishment for his father's failure, Bellatrix initially saw it as an excellent opportunity for her nephew to prove his worth. She offered Draco guidance and training, attempting to prepare him both technically and psychologically for what would be required of him. However, she quickly became frustrated with what she perceived as the young man's hesitation and weakness. Draco's reluctance to fully embrace the violence required for his duties confirmed Bellatrix's worst suspicions about the softening influence Narcissa had exerted on her son. She began to see Draco as an example of what happened when pure ideology was diluted by maternal sentimentality, and her attempts to correct him became increasingly harsh and intimidating. The situation came to a head when it became clear that Draco could not accomplish his mission without assistance. Bellatrix, who had invested considerable time and energy in trying to mold her nephew, was deeply disappointed by his apparent failure. She began to question whether the Malfoy line, despite its former purity of blood, had become tainted by generations of comfortable living that had softened its resolve. This disillusionment with her nephew also affected her relationship with Narcissa. Bellatrix blamed her sister for raising Draco in a way that failed to adequately prepare him for the realities of serving Voldemort. Tensions between the sisters, which had been suppressed by years of family loyalty, began to surface in ways that threatened to further divide the already fractured Black family. Malfoy Manor, where Voldemort established one of his main bases during this period, became a regular meeting place for Bellatrix. She would spend weeks at a time residing there, ostensibly to be available for consultations with Voldemort, but also because physical proximity to him fueled her obsession. During these periods, she frequently clashed with other residents of the manor, particularly Lucius Malfoy, whom she considered inadequately dedicated to the cause. It was at Malfoy Manor that Bellatrix committed some of her most horrific acts during this period. When Harry Potter, Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger were captured and brought to the manor, Bellatrix saw an opportunity to impress Voldemort by extracting crucial information from the prisoners. Her torture of Hermione Granger, a Muggle-born, was particularly brutal, even by Bellatrix's standards. The torture session revealed disturbing aspects of Bellatrix's psychology that had developed during her years of service to Voldemort. She didn't torture simply to obtain information, but seemed to derive genuine, almost sexual pleasure from the act of inflicting pain. Her application of the Cruciatus Curse was accompanied by an emotional intensity that suggested torture had become a form of artistic expression for her. Even more disturbing was the way Bellatrix used her own dagger to carve the word mudblood into Hermione's arm. This act went beyond practical torture into the realm of sadistic ritual, demonstrating that Bellatrix had developed her own personal liturgies of cruelty that combined her supremacist ideology with her violent impulses. The precision and deliberation with which she executed this mutilation suggested that she had performed similar acts many times before. The escape of the prisoners from Malfoy Manor represented a humiliating failure for Bellatrix, who had personally assured Voldemort that she would extract all necessary information from the captives. The loss of not only the prisoners, but also crucial information about their activities resulted in one of the few occasions when Voldemort expressed direct displeasure with Bellatrix's performance. This rebuke had a devastating effect on her psyche, confirming her worst fears that she had failed her master. Bellatrix's reaction to this failure was characteristic of her obsessive personality. Instead of accepting responsibility or trying to learn from her mistake, she became consumed by a desire for revenge against those who had escaped. Her pursuit of Harry Potter in particular became even more personal and intense, fueled not only by loyalty to Voldemort, but by a desperate need to redeem herself in his eyes. During the final months before the Battle of Hogwarts, Bellatrix became increasingly unstable and desperate. The pressure of maintaining her position as Voldemort's favorite, combined with the growing resistance to her forces, began to erode even her considerable mental strength. She developed a growing paranoia about possible traitors among the Death Eaters and began making increasingly wild accusations against colleagues she suspected of disloyalty. This growing instability manifested itself in increasingly capricious and irrational outbursts of violence. Bellatrix began punishing subordinates for imagined infractions, interpreting casual comments as signs of disrespect, and seeing conspiracies where none existed. Her mental deterioration was evident to those around her, but her close proximity to Voldemort meant that few dared to confront her directly about her behavior. The Battle of Hogwarts in May 1998 represented both the peak and the end of Bellatrix's career as a Death Eater. She entered the battle with a mixture of fanatical excitement and growing despair, knowing that this would be the final confrontation that would determine the fate of everything she had fought for. Her participation in the battle was characterized by the same creative brutality that had marked her entire career, but also by growing signs that her sanity was finally beginning to unravel. During the battle, Bellatrix once again demonstrated why she was considered one of the most dangerous combat witches of her generation. She fought multiple opponents simultaneously, including some of Britain's most experienced aurors, and held her own against more than just her own defense. Her ability to quickly switch between different styles of combat magic, from sophisticated defensive spells to devastating offensive curses, demonstrated a technical mastery few of her contemporaries could match. However, it was also during this battle that Bellatrix's psychological limitations finally became apparent. Her obsession with Voldemort led her to make tactical mistakes that a fighter of her experience would normally avoid. She frequently distracted herself from the immediate combat to check on Voldemort's status, and her emotional need to impress him led her to take unnecessary risks that exposed her to attack. The decisive moment came when Bellatrix engaged in combat with Molly Weasley, the matriarch of the Weasley family who had lost a son in the battle. This confrontation was particularly symbolic. Bellatrix, who represented the corrupted magical aristocracy and supremacist ideology, against Molly, who embodied traditional family values and protective maternal love. For Bellatrix, Molly represented everything she despised about the sentimental weakness she believed was contaminating the wizarding world. Initially, the duel seemed to favor Bellatrix, whose combat experience and vast array of offensive spells gave her a clear technical advantage. She attacked Molly with a combination of curses that would have quickly defeated most opponents, demonstrating once again her exceptional skill. However, she fatally underestimated the intensity of Molly's maternal rage and the power such pure emotion could bestow on a determined witch. Molly Weasley, fighting not only for her own life, but for the memory of her dead son and the safety of her surviving children, channeled an emotional strength that transcended technical limitations. When she screamed, "Don't touch my daughter," and cast the curse that would kill Bellatrix, she was expressing not just personal rage, but the collective outrage of all the families who had suffered under Voldemort's terror. Bellatrix Lestrange fell to a swift and irrevocable death. The witch who had survived Azkaban, who had become the most loyal of all Death Eaters, who had dedicated her entire life to the service of Lord Voldemort, fell to the floor of the Great Hall of Hogwarts like any ordinary mortal. Her final expression was one of utter surprise. Until the last moment, her supremacist arrogance had prevented her from conceiving that she could be defeated by someone she considered inherently inferior. The impact of Bellatrix's death on the course of the battle was immediate and significant. Voldemort, who had always considered Bellatrix one of his most trusted weapons, reacted to her death with a rage that transcended even his normal patterns. His impulsive attempt to avenge Bellatrix by attacking Molly Weasley brought him into direct conflict with Harry Potter at the crucial moment, contributing to the chain of events that would lead to his own ultimate destruction. For those who witnessed Bellatrix's death, the moment represented more than just the elimination of a dangerous enemy. It symbolized the defeat of the ideology she had embodied, the belief that birth and lineage conferred natural rights of dominion over others. Her death at the hands of a witch from a common family viscerally demonstrated the falsity of the supremacist theories that had shaped her entire life. Bellatrix Lestrange's legacy in the post-war wizarding world was complex and deeply disturbing. On the one hand, her death represented the end of one of the most immediate threats to the peace and stability of the wizarding world. On the other, the extent of her atrocities and the lasting impact of her actions would continue to haunt her victims and their families for generations. The true tragedy of Bellatrix Lestrange lay not only in the atrocities she committed, but in the fact that she possessed all the qualities necessary to have been a force for good in the world. Her intelligence, determination, magical ability, and even her capacity for passionate devotion could have been channeled for constructive purposes under different circumstances. Instead, she repeatedly chose darkness, each decision leading her deeper down a path from which there was no return. And so ends the story of Bellatrix Lestrange, a witch who began her life with every privilege and opportunity, but chose to become the embodiment of evil. Her life serves as a grim reminder that heroism and villainy are not accidents of birth, but the result of conscious choices made day after day. In every moment where she could have chosen compassion, she chose cruelty. In every opportunity to show mercy, she chose violence. And in the end, her choices defined her completely, transforming her from Bellatrix Black, the promising young woman from a noble family, into Bellatrix Lestrange, a name that would be whispered in fear for generations. Her story teaches us that evil rarely emerges fully formed, but grows gradually through small concessions to darkness, small rationalizations of cruelty, and small betrayals of conscience. Bellatrix Lestrange was not born a monster. She became one choice at a time, until there was nothing left of the young witch she could have been, only the terrible creature she chose to become. And perhaps that is the most haunting lesson her life has to offer, that we all have the capacity for both ultimate good and absolute evil, and that our choices, not our birth, determine who we become. If you've made it this far on this dark journey through the mind and life of one of history's most dangerous witches, you've demonstrated the courage needed to confront the most difficult truths about human nature. Bellatrix Lestrange's story isn't just about a woman who chose evil. It's about how hatred can corrupt even the most talented among us, how obsession can destroy any vestige of humanity, and how our choices echo through generations. If this delve into the depths of magical darkness has made you reflect on the importance of compassion and justice in our own lives, then our journey was worth every moment. Don't forget to like this story if it resonated with you. Share it with those brave enough to face these dark truths, and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of the wizarding world's deepest mysteries. Because, as we learned today, knowing evil is the first step to choosing good. See you in the next story, and remember, in a world where darkness exists, our individual light matters more than we can ever imagine.